This is Dr. Kathryn Hall. She's a 2010 graduate of BBSH. She has a PhD in microbiology and molecular genetics from Harvard. She has an MA in documentary filmmaking from Emerson College. Wait, I'm not finished. She has studied indigenous African spiritual technologies with Malidoma Somé. She has an MPH from Harvard School of Public Health. She's currently faculty at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, where she does research on the genetics of the placebo effect.
Why do people respond to quote-unquote nothing to inert treatments? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the word placebo is a word that was originally from a translation in the Bible, placebo domino in regione vivorum. I will please the Lord in the land of the living. And this quote, verse from Psalms was interpreted that somehow, when you're dead, people need to cry at your funeral. And so the wealthy people, they weren't really into going to people's funerals and crying. So what they did is they hired mourners, and these mourners would, go to your funeral, call for the wailing women to come, send for the most skillful of them to cry at your funeral, and they became known as placebos. So right away, placebo had a kind of negative connotation. It was a sham, a fake, not real, not genuine. And even, if we fast forward to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, he had a character that was very kind of fawning and false, and his name was Placebo. So placebo, the word itself, had a very negative origin. But as you look through history, you see that placebos were used in kind of two ways. One was they were used as a salve, and two, they were used as controls in experiments or studies. So as a salve, here's a quote from the 1700s from William Cullen, and he says here, Mr. Gilchrist was regarded as absolutely incurable, hastening fast to his fate. I prescribe, therefore, in pure placebo, but I make it a rule, even in employing placebos, to give what would have a tendency to be of use to the patient. So back in the 1700s, it was understood that you could give a patient an inert treatment and it would help them, and it was okay. They were dispensed, they were basically thought to be either weak, so if mercury worked really well, you'd just use a tincture of mercury. And it was basically, to please the patient, to calm the patient. And it wasn't considered fraudulent or deceptive. It was not used for flattery or fraud, but there was a real therapeutic objective. Fast forward to Thomas Jefferson. He said he knew many physicians in his time that used bread pills, drops of colored water, and powders of hickory ashes. And Richard Cabot, who is a very famous clinician and physician at Harvard, said he was brought up, as I suppose every physician is, and this is in 1903, to use placebo, bread pills, water subcutaneously, and other devices. I doubt if there is a physician in this room who has not used them and used them pretty often. I use them by the bushels. So on the one hand, you have this kind of beneficent use of placebos, and on the other hand, there was a use of placebos to kind of unmask fraud. In the 1700s, around 1780s, there was a physician named Franz Mesmer in Germany, and he claimed to have discovered a natural energetic transference between all animated and inanimate objects called animal magnetism. And animal magnetism later became mesmerism, and King Louis VI was very concerned that all this attention was going to Franz Mesmer, and he wanted to understand, is this physical force, animal magnetism, real? So he created a commission, and this is a picture, an engraving from the commission, and you can see here, there in the middle is the man with the whip, and he's driving out the devil, who was Franz Mesmer. And what they did was, they made this commission that had very famous chemists. Lavoisier was there, Benjamin Franklin, who was his then American ambassador to France, he was on this commission. And what they did was they created people who were artificially mesmerics, or artificially, they didn't actually mesmerize the objects, and then they would use them, and then people would go into these like fits or paroxysms and claim they were better, but they were basically using inert treatments to solicit the response, and then so they said, well, then it's not true. And so that's essentially how the other way placebos were used, is to control and to test various modes of healing. When we fast forward to the 1940s, after World War II, is when you really see a big shift in how placebos are used. So up until this time, there are these odd little uses of placebos, and then there's this, in testing things, but then there's this big, belief system where it's fine to give somebody a bread pill if you don't have anything else to give them, or it's fine to give them a bread pill because it'll probably help them. But come 1944, around the time of the first clinical trial, people came back from the war. They needed to get drugs out to people. They needed to do it very quickly. And as it turns out, if you wanted to test a drug, they wanted to test it against nothing, and nobody wanted to be given nothing. Everybody wanted a drug. So they said, we could use these placebos. And so very quickly, placebos became part of clinical trials. But now it became under the control of the government and soon to be the FDA. And now it became illegal, not okay, deceptive, fraudulent to give somebody a placebo. So around this time is when you see this really big change. And as more and more people in clinical trials used placebos, they started to know, well, people are actually really getting better with these placebos. And in 1955, Henry Beecher, who was then at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, published a groundbreaking paper called The Powerful Placebo. And he in this paper said, it is evident that placebos have a real therapeutic effect being produced in about 35% of cases. And there's been a lot of debate about his statistics and his math and his calculation, but what's really amazing is that number is, it's actually hovering around 33%, that about 33% of people tend to be placebo responders, which is an interesting and ironic thing, and we'll touch upon that in a minute. So let's fast forward to 2016. I went on the web, and I said, how many trials have failed from placebo response? And within the first page, this is what I got. Basically, clinical trials are not working anymore because, especially if they're in a domain like irritable bowel syndrome, depression, a neurological disease or pain, there is a very high placebo response, and for some reason it's getting bigger. We don't really understand that, but we have our theories that they're being driven by commercials on television. I was a student here at BBSH doing healings when I went home. My healings for the period in between. I had a guy who came to me the day before he was supposed to have surgery on his molars, and he was in a lot of pain, and I did a healing on him. He went home, and he never had the surgery. He was amazed. He felt healed. I was like, wow. So I was intrigued by, I really felt when I was working on him, I felt energy flowing through me. I was doing all the things that we'd learned to do, grounding. And, there was a lot going on in the room energetically, but I was actually kind of amazed at that outcome. And I really wanted to start to understand, well, what is this placebo response? Not to say that that was a placebo response, but what is this ability to heal from something that is not, a pharmaceutical drug, let's say, or a surgery. So what are the factors that influence placebo response? Natural history is one. So natural history is basically if somebody comes in and you're a physician or a healer and they have a common cold, if you treat them for 7 days, they're probably going to get better. Natural history, you're sick, you're going to get better if you have a common cold. I mean, it's just the natural history of the disease. Regression to the mean is basically a statistical term that says if people are very, very sick, you're going to see big effects when they get better because they started off as being very, very sick. Hawthorne effect is a term that is derived from a study that was done at the Hawthorne factory on lighting for the workers. Basically, they figured out if they made the lights really bright, they worked more efficiently. And then they did another study where they dulled the lights, and they actually worked really efficiently as well. And they realized, oh, if we're watching the workers, they're going to work better. So that's the Hawthorne effect. But what we really are interested in is the second half of these, is expectation. How does expectation influence somebody's response to a treatment? And how do the symbols and rituals associated with that treatment contribute to the healing? And how does the interaction between the patient and the practitioner contribute to this healing? And also, one of my big areas of study is what happens in terms of the physiology and who are these placebo responders and non-responders from a genetic point of view. So we're going to talk about some of that. And I'm going to walk you through some studies that look at aspects of this. So let's talk about the patient-practitioner interaction. That's something that everybody as a healer has to think about. So we actually did a study on this, and here are some of the elements that we looked at in the study. We looked at a combination of thoughtful silence and taking a moment to really listen to the patient, to be present with the patient. So you have to listen to the patient, establishing eye contact with the patient so they really know that you're listening. Expressing confidence about the treatment, and obviously the symbols of the treatment, the white coat, the stethoscope in a physician's office are very powerful. On the other side is a patient who has their expectations. They come in with their genetics, and they come in with their personality, which is very closely, in some cases, tied to their genetics, but also to their experiences in life. So in this first study I'm going to talk about, what we did is we looked at patients with irritable bowel syndrome. So we had 3 treatment arms, a waitlist arm, a limited placebo arm, and an augmented arm. And so what this study was trying to do was to titrate the placebo response by adding, basically a dose escalation version of the placebo response. So the waiting list, that's the Hawthorne effect. You're in a trial, you're being watched, you're being checked. The limited placebo was done with sham acupuncture. So there's an intervention, there's a ritual. The sham acupuncture uses what's called a Streitbart needle, invented by this guy Streitbart. A regular needle will go right into the skin, but in the sham needle, it's like a trick sword that, when you push it in, it goes up the shaft. So the needle actually doesn't penetrate the skin. And then the augmented arm, which consisted of basically all these 3, because you're in a trial, you're getting the sham acupuncture, but you're also getting a warm, caring practitioner who is empathetic, confident, actively listens, has to do 20 seconds of thoughtful silence, and has to establish physical contact, has to take the pulse of the patient. And I mean, the results were, as you would of course expect. There was a significant improvement in people in the augmented arm relative to people on the limited arm, and people on the wait list had the smallest effect. And what's on the y-axis here is the change in the symptom severity of these people with irritable bowel syndrome. So this tells us right away that how you interact with your client, how you interact with the patient, I mean, we know this, but I think it's really an interesting way of doing this experiment because it's all about inert quote-unquote inert treatments. Another interesting study that was done was this one. This is Ted Kapchuk, who's my mentor and I work really closely with. Ted trained in China and is an acupuncturist. And he's one of the only people ever at Harvard Medical School who's been promoted to full professor without having a graduate degree. So he's a very interesting character. So Ted designed this experiment where he wanted to test the labeling on the pill. So in people with migraines, he got them, 66 people, to take different types of pills, and they had about 460 different migraine attacks. And I suffer from migraine, and I have to say, I don't know what I would do if somebody gave me a placebo pill for that migraine and it didn't work. But anyway, they did have rescue medications, so if you didn't get relief from the drug that you were given, you could take a real max salt pill. So the pills were labeled like this. It was either a placebo pill or a max salt pill, and the placebo pill was either labeled as placebo, unlabeled, so you didn't know, there was some uncertainty, or it was labeled as max salt, or the max salt pill was labeled as placebo, or the max salt pill was labeled as max salt, or it was unlabeled, so you didn't know what you were getting. And interestingly enough, what they saw was the people who had no treatment, they had no change in their symptoms, no improvement. The people who did the best were the people who had max salt. A real max salt pill did the best. That's what you would hopefully expect from the pharmaceutical industry, right? And the unlabeled max salt pill also did really well. But look at this. The placebo pill labeled as max salt did almost as well as the max salt pill labeled as placebo. So I think, like our brains are doing something here. Our cognition is really kind of dictating our biology, if you will. And one more study. This is a study of asthma, and here they wanted to use something that was, because migraine, you could say your head hurts or your head doesn't hurt, who knows? This is how physicians think. I apologize. And I apologize to any physicians in the room. I'm not a physician, so I'm at liberty, and my wife is a physician, so I have to be careful. But what they wanted was to use something that was measurable, right? You could basically weigh it or get a meter that would say it objectively. So they wanted to do asthma and measure the forced expiratory volume, like how much you can blow out of your mouth when you have asthma. And so they gave people a real inhaler with albuterol, or a placebo pill, or a placebo albuterol, so no albuterol, sham acupuncture, or a no treatment control. And you can see here that there was no difference in the forced expiratory volume between placebo, sham acupuncture, and the wait list. But here the drug is really having a good effect on your forced expiratory volume. But when they asked the people how they felt, what they found was actually they felt really great with placebo albuterol and sham acupuncture. And it was essentially equivalent to albuterol, and of course, no effect on the no treatment intervention. So again, there's something going on in our heads, and maybe it's not just our heads, I'll give us that, but there's something going on that is more complicated than just these drugs. We know the mechanism of the drug. It's going to cause the endothelial lining of the lungs to relax, and this is how this drug works. Maybe more to it than that. So he was happy to learn that I had prescribed a placebo, but when I told him it was an extra strength placebo, he was pleased. What is actually going on behind the scenes? What is going on in our bodies when we're having these responses to these inert treatments? So back in the 70s, there was a group, Levine, Gordon, and Fields, did these wonderful studies with molar extractions. So basically, they would, have people who were having their teeth pulled, and they would give them morphine or placebo, and they would actually show that a placebo pill was almost equivalent to 8 milligrams of morphine. And what was interesting is, placebo, it was IV treatment. And what was interesting is, and these studies were done by another group in Italy many years later as well, if you administered the morphine in front of the patient, it was way more effective than if they didn't see you giving them the morphine. So there's definitely something about seeing the ritual of the process of the healing. Now, what's really interesting about these guys as well is they also, when they gave placebo and they saw this wonderful, reduction in pain, they also gave them this drug called naloxone. And naloxone inhibits signaling through the opioid receptor, and the opioid receptor is basically your endorphin, your endogenous opioids that help reduce your experience of pain. And so they were able to block the placebo response using a drug that blocked opioid signaling. And so the thinking is, the placebo response must work through the opioid pathway. And that makes a lot of sense. And once we got to the 2000s, when neuroimaging was available, people started to give people treatments and look at their brains at the same time to find out what was happening. And they looked at opioid signaling, but they also looked at dopamine signaling. And what you can see here, these are the brains of somebody who has Parkinson's disease. What they use is a radioactive dye, and when dopamine is binding to that part of the brain, the radioactive dye is basically replaced by dopamine, so it gets weaker and weaker. And you can see here that before placebo, there's, the radioactive dye is here, and after placebo, it's gotten much lighter in this area of the brain. So that means that dopamine is being activated in the brain when somebody's being given a placebo. And this part of the brain is associated with the reward, like under our processing of the information around a reward. These studies were done in pain, and basically, as these studies have been done, what we've learned is that the areas in the brain that are lit up when people get placebo are areas associated with reward, expectation, cognitive and emotional integration, pain, and cognitive and motor control. There's a big placebo response in Parkinson's disease. That's very interesting. So what they found was the amount of signal in the brain is proportional to the amount that people expect to get better. So the more you expect that this drug, which is actually a placebo, is going to work, the more dopamine is present or being activated in the brain. And that people who were non-responders actually had less activation in the brain. Like it basically, it didn't go up, it actually went down. So something else is going on in the non-responders. So when we came along, we decided that we wanted to figure out if we could predict who was a placebo responder and who was not a placebo responder. And what we did is we looked at genes associated with dopamine. There's a wonderful genetic polymorphism, which means a change in a gene of an enzyme that breaks down dopamine. And what this happens with this polymorphism is some people have 3-4 more dopamine in their brains, and some people have 3 to 4-fold less. So it's like nature's little gift to the scientist. So basically, this enzyme is called COMT, catechol-O-methyltransferase, COMT. And COMT is an enzyme that breaks down catecholamines. And dopamine is a catecholamine. And a catecholamine is a molecule that basically has a phenyl ring with 2 oxygen, hydrogen, or hydroxyl groups on the end. Dopamine is a catecholamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and estrogen, a byproduct of estrogen. These are all catecholamines, and these are all broken down by the same enzyme. And we basically, here you can see that, there's one version of the enzyme genetically that allows you to have more dopamine because less is broken down, and one version that allows you to have more dopamine because it doesn't work as well. And so what we wanted to ask the question is, if we looked in that same acupuncture study with the warm, caring practitioner, could we see that some people responded more than others? And that's exactly what we saw. The placebo responders were actually the people who had high dopamine here. And the placebo non-responders are the people who had low dopamine. And this is in the augmented arm, in the arm where you had the warm, caring interaction. There was really no difference in the wait list, and there was really no difference in the limited arm. The people who were driving this strong placebo response are people who had a lot of dopamine in their brains, or more dopamine relative to the other people. When I saw this, I was really excited. I thought, as any scientist who is working on their own project, we get very tunnel visioned, and we believe like our story is the story. So I went to a talk, it happened, and these people were talking about the women's health study. Does anybody know about the women's health study? Yeah, it's 40,000 women were randomized to placebo, aspirin, or vitamin E for 10 years, and they took one of those pills every other day for 10 years, starting in 1993 till around 2003. And so the chief of the division that had done this study, Joanne Manson, was giving this talk, and she turned to the audience, and I was sitting in the audience, and she said, after 10 years, we did this trial, and what we found at the end was there was no difference between aspirin and vitamin E, and no difference between aspirin and vitamin E and placebo. Basically, their trial didn't work. And she turned to the audience, she goes, does anybody know why? Which was kind of a weird question. Like, people don't usually do that. But I was sitting and I was like, I know why. It's because of my gene, right? It's the gene I'm interested in. And so when I went to documentary film school, we had one of our last classes there was a master class in the elevator pitch. And it was given by Suzanne de Paz. Anybody who knows who that is? Right, she's the CEO of Motown, right? She discovered the Jacksons. So she gives us this master class on the elevator pitch, because we're all filmmakers. No offense to any filmmakers, and I wanted to be one of you. Didn't work out for me, but so I was like, I'm going to tell Joanne Manson, the chief of this division of preventive medicine, who's done this big study, is clearly a full professor at Harvard, and a big deal, that she should look in her trial and see if dopamine levels modified people's response to cardiovascular, like whether or not they had an MI in their trial. So I'm like, okay, you can do this, right? You went to Brennan school, you can like hold hara, you can presence, you can do it. So I go out and I'm looking around, and she's God. She's God. She's not there. And I was like, and then I did the whole masochistic thing, right? Like, why'd you have to do it? You can. And I'm doing this whole thing, and all of a sudden I hear bing, and the elevator opens, and I hear a door open behind me, and out walks Joanne Manson from the restroom, and she walks right towards the elevator. I'm standing in front of the elevator. Obviously, I got to get in the elevator. Obviously, I got to get in the elevator with Joanne Manson. So we get in the elevator together, and I'm like, elevator pitch. Hi, Dr. Manson, I really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to suggest that I know you had a high placebo response, and we're studying a gene called catecholomethyltransferase that seems to have evolved in dopamine levels, and we think it's associated with placebo response, and perhaps it was bing! By the time we got to the bottom of the thing, she was like, I'd be happy to do that. Send me an email. So I was really excited, and I ran back to my office, and of course I sent the email right away. I know you're supposed to wait a week, but no, I'm just kidding. So I sent the email like right away. I'm one of those people. Here is the design of that trial, right? They had 4 arms. These women either got aspirin, placebo, or vitamin E, or aspirin and vitamin E. And the outcomes were your rate of myocardial infarction, stroke, or death from any cardiovascular disease cause, or your rate of cancer. And back in the 90s, it was thought that aspirin protected from cardiovascular disease, and vitamin E, an antioxidant, could protect from cancer. And what you can see here is the result of looking at it's not my gene, our gene, catecholomethyltransferase COMT, in women in just the placebo arm. So on this axis here are the 10 years of the trial, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And on this axis is the incidence of cardiovascular diseases. In the way they draw these graphs, they're called Kaplan-Meier curves. And it's kind of sick, but it is what it is. So every time somebody has an event, the graph goes up, right? So this is an event. So these people are having more events over the 10 years than these people. And as you know, if you want something to be real in science, it has to have a probability of less than 0.05. And this had a probability of 0.0007. So it was real, or it was statistically significant. So that meant that indeed the gene that we're interested in, COMT, was associated with responses in the placebo arm. But here is the sick twist, because this is how nature is. Nature just kind of strings you along and then says, well, it's not that simple. It turns out that the people who had the highest incidence of cardiovascular disease were my placebo responders in the other trial. So it's flipped. The people who had the lowest rate of cardiovascular disease were the placebo non-responders, and that's not what I expected, even though this is what every other cardiologist in our group expected. Why? Because COMT breaks down dopamine, but it also breaks down epinephrine, norepinephrine, and catechol-estrogen. So if you have more dopamine in your brain, you also have more epinephrine available. And epinephrine is your fight or flight hormone, and when you're stressed, what goes up? Epinephrine, right? When you're going to have an acute coronary syndrome event, if you have too much epinephrine, that can trigger it. So epinephrine is actually a molecule, a neurotransmitter or hormone, depending on your perspective, that can cause cardiovascular disease, and that could be what we're seeing here. It could be nothing to do with the placebo response. It could just be that these people are more prone to have cardiovascular disease. The key thing is that, there's a lot. Obama has a big initiative called the Precision Medicine Initiative, which is kind of a remake of the Personalized Medicine Initiative, which is basically to say, let's make drugs that are specific to individuals. And I think that the driver for making drugs that are specific to individuals in their brains is based on genetics. But I think for us, because we know more, should be based on a lot of other things. And I think, we learn a lot about people's defenses, people's strengths, people's experiences, and why not people's genetics as well. So I think that, as healers in the world, we have to understand the whole person and all the forces that work on us and them. And I'm basically showing you just one slice, which is this, placebo pathway that has to do with opioid receptors and dopamine. It's funny, I remember one of the things I remember coming back here was one of my favorite days. I think it was year 3 or year 4. Kathy, when we had the exercise where we were learning how to do guidance, was that year 3? Year 3. And so we had to kind of sit here and ask for a vision or some information. And I was sitting and I was like, trying to think. Okay, calm down, just think. And I'm like, and all of a sudden I saw this oh wow, that's a really pretty river, and the river was flowing down. It was just going over the rocks, and I saw the river, and I saw these trees that were beside the river, and I saw these beautiful blocks of wood that were carved, and for some reason, I don't think I ran my hand across them, but I could tell they were really smooth rock, bricks, wooden blocks. And so there was this path going with these blocks, and I was like, wow, that's just beautiful. And I heard a voice saying, that's your path. Why don't you get on it? So, I think that I have so much to be thankful for this experience here. My teachers were amazing. Anne Hoy was my BIP, and she saw me through a lot. So thank you so much for having me back. I hope I have shared with you that the history of placebo response has come full circle as we've kind of come back from, the days of kind of putting it aside. Now we're studying it to see if we can't, as one pharma company said to me, make it our new druggable target. Although, you know what, I have to say, in one of those kind of moments when I try and sit, I don't do it as much as I'd like to, but I try and sit and say, you know, what information, like what can come in? And as I was doing that, the information that came in to me was like, actually, it's always been our druggable target. I think our drugs actually target, a lot of our drugs target the placebo response. Just think if you can boost it, then you really can help a patient. And I think what we do as healers is actually boost that placebo response. So this placebo response is a measurable physiological change, and the individual responses vary. They vary by genotype, and some people are predisposed to have stronger placebo responses. So I think it's important, and here's I think my punchline, is understanding all the factors that contribute to disease and healing and how to optimize the healing process. It's not good English, I'm still searching for it, but yeah, if we understand kind of all the pieces, we can integrate them and hopefully, I think be more effective healers. Thank you.